at this stage in the development of the painting, it's important to start to lay in the greens. Although I have greens that I've pre-mixed in plastic containers that are ready to go, here's one. What I would like to do is use this clean palette to mix some new greens. So, I've squeezed out a bit of aureolin yellow in there that I'm going to use as one of my foundation yellows. And here I placed cobalt blue. This bin is reserved for Antwerp blue. And I would also like to mix a green using a little bit of cerulean blue. And to achieve the basic green that I see in the photo, I'll use my aureolin yellow as the foundation color and mix that with some cobalt blue to start off with. Yes, that's a nice, natural looking green. Beautiful. But where do I want to lay in the green? Let's start with this one over here. We have two leaves that touch and overlap one another. That's nice. And actually, there seems to be a very subtle hint of burnt sienna under the green, so I'm going to actually start with a wash, a very light wash of burnt sienna. I know, it looks crazy. I want a green leaf, but I'm starting with burnt sienna. I often do this because in nature you see wonderful little accents of other colors occurring in the dominant color area, and this is how I achieve it in my watercolors. Now the green will effectively push the burnt sienna around into the edges. These are nice little filaments of leaf-like material coming out, and they have a definite brown quality to them. Okay, we lay in our burnt sienna. Now we flow in the green. That's nice. Same thing here. I lay in my brown first. Now I flow in my green. Even on a zero brush, you could have too much paint. I don't want it to spill. Here's a wonderfully long leaf that tucks itself underneath the petal of the flower, and it's a darker leaf. I'm going to begin by priming the paper in that area. I will go to my undercoat of burnt sienna. Burnt sienna. And my mixed green. This is a beautiful little shape here. The leaf folds over upon itself, and that's a lot of fun to do. I think I'll start with the lighter background part. Little redrawing is in order. What I'll do is lay in a wash for the whole area, since it's my lightest value. Then I'll paint the darker colors on top of the light wash. And I think for this one I'm going to leave out the burnt sienna and go directly into my green. Working some additional yellows on top of that. I've spent a bit of time working around the entire magnolia flower, but I'd like to get back to this area now that all of this is dry and I've done quite a bit of work. A little earlier you watched me lay in a light wash throughout the whole leaf area. The reason why I do that is when I approach a subject like this, I like to apply the lightest version of the dominant color throughout the area. Then I'll allow that to dry and work into darker values. Now the overlapping leaf is the darker value. As we can see in our photo, this is the section we're about to paint. I very lightly dampen that area, and only that area, using my number 6 round watercolor brush. I pick up my mixed green, that's a combination of aureolin yellow and cobalt blue, and I lay it in. It works its way up. Nice, and also along that edge. I'm switching to my zero brush at this point because I would like to just add a little bit more paint into that area right there. And the number 6 is a little too large. While it's still damp, I think it would be a good time to indicate some of the soft focus veins that appear in this leaf. There's a nice little thing going on in this area too that I would like to capture with a darker green. These are the kind of simple details that are a lot of fun. Watch this. Now what I'll do is I'll flow a little water into that to give it character. The reason why I like to flow a little water in after I lay in the color is because it pushes pigment towards the perimeter or the edge of the water area. And as the paint dries, you get a beautiful little line. And I think that enhances the realism of the subject. And now I will flow in my green. Once the green dries, if I a need to adjust it down in value so it appears to be in a shadow area, I'll wash over it with a little bit of cobalt blue. I paint wet into wet when I intend to achieve soft focus areas. While that's drying, it would be a good time to mask in the branch. I'd like to point out that I've put some of this drawing gum, this is my favorite brand to use, Pabio drawing gum, into a bottle dispenser like this because I find it very easy then to apply it to wherever I have to apply it and then move it around with my brush. You can also purchase masking fluid in bottles like this. To spread the masking fluid, I'm going to use a older worn out brush. I don't want to ruin one of my new brushes. And here's what we do. We flow it in place. Please take careful notice of how I flow it in place. I don't brush it on thinly. I actually flow it as a fairly thick stream of masking material. It's easier to apply it this way than if you brushed it on thinly. The branch has been completely masked out. I also pulled masking fluid over an area that I had already painted. This can be done as long as you don't overwork that area. Two things to note. The paper has to be absolutely dry when you apply the masking fluid. If not, you're going to run into big problems when it's time to remove it. Number two, never accelerate the drying of the masking fluid with a hairdryer or any other drying device, because rapid drying of the masking fluid will cause the material to break down and become gummy and impossible to remove. I'm going to give this a few hours and we'll come back later. Now that the masking material is dry, I can lay in the background. I leave the paper taped down to the piece of plexiglass. It's simply personal preference. I like to expose the entire surface of the paper and paint to my edges. And then I paint a border around the piece, like I did in the Rubrum Lily watercolor painting. And my method of having it lie flat is quite simple. I simply dampen the back of the paper. And cover it for about 10 minutes. That'll allow the paper to hydrate, it'll soften the paper, and it'll lay flat, and I'm ready for painting in the background. Let's see what we got. Remove the lid. Beautiful. It's laying nice and flat. Now what I need to do is dampen the areas that I intend to paint. And I can completely ignore this area because it's protected with masking. This works because it's a small painting. I would never use this unusual approach in anything larger than, say, 8 by 10. As you know, I've pointed out numerous times that I like mixing large quantities of paints in these plastic bins because often my paintings are quite large and I need much more paint than I can fit in a little tray like this. The idea behind the background is not to copy what I see in the photo, and actually my photo is pretty bad for the background. It contains a road and a mailbox, and we simply don't want that in the painting. But what I do like to do is take the color suggestions that are provided by the background image and simply let the colors flow as I see them, let them mingle and do their own thing to create an abstract field of color. I'm using a mixture of Antwerp blue and brown matter to create this beautiful dark gray. The beauty of the masking is I don't have to worry about this area now. I can just flow my paint right on top of the masking into that beautiful gray. I see some warm burnt siennas. Notice I'm not brushing it in. I'm flowing it and I'm allowing it to bleed on its own. That's the beauty of watercolor. The fluidity of the material allows for wonderful interactions of color. I want to minimize my brushwork. Although some brushing is necessary, of course, we're painting. But the idea is to let the color flow on its own. At this time, I like to go to my Antwerp blue because I see hints of that in the background. In this area, I need to work in some of the more subtle cobalt blue. And I see lots of greens, so I'm going to take some of this pre-mixed green that I prepared and sprinkle it in. I think what we're seeing is out of focus leaves in the background. I'd like to modulate this area to a golden brown. I see hints of that in the photo. So let's work it in. Oh, that's beautiful color. I'm liking what I see, and my gut feeling is to stop before I ruin it. That's the key with watercolor painting. You gotta quit while you're ahead. I originally applied the masking material to the area of the stem to protect that area from the background wash. When the masking material was completely dry, I flowed in the background wash. Now that the background wash is completed and has been allowed to dry overnight, I can now safely remove the masking material. The point to keep in mind is never rush the job. Never attempt to remove the masking material while the paper is wet. That'll result in a disaster. You'll ruin your piece. So let me repeat, never attempt to accelerate the drying process by using a hairdryer to quickly dry the masking material. The heat from the hairdryer will break down the masking material. It'll get gummy and stick to the paper and be impossible to remove. Now, how do I remove it? Well, if your hands are clean and dry, you can actually just start rubbing into it. See what happens? It begins to lift up. And you could peel it away. It might be a safer bet to use a kneaded eraser or a rubber cement pickup designed to remove material like masking. With the kneaded eraser, you could simply rub into the masking material and it'll come right off. As we move into the final steps of this painting, it's time to lay in the branch. See how the branch is essentially gray with hints of other colors and is composed of segments. That's how we'll approach it. We'll wet a segment, apply our colors, allow that to dry before we move on to the next segment. To begin painting the stem, I'll dampen the area that I'm going to apply my gray wash. And to make that gray, I mixed Antwerp blue with brown matter. Produces a beautiful gray. Flow in the the gray. The dominant color in the branch is actually a blue highlight. It may be picking up ambient light from the sky. So I'm going to work in my blue, and I'll also work in burnt sienna, because I see that. Apply the gray wash. And wash in a little bit more of that blue. And brown. Now, I'll continue to build into the branch area. I lifted it out to achieve the highlight on the surface in that area. I see a very strong highlight in the photo, but I also wanted to accentuate the shade. So I reworked a little bit of my gray into that area. And looking at the photo of the actual flower, I see this leaf over here has some sharper veins in it. And I'd like to show you how to do that. I don't use my brush to paint in a line that I intend to be a vein. What I do is I'll wash in the green. I make sure the line, the boundary line of where I flow the water is where I want that vein to be. Then, squeezing out a little bit of paint on that brush, suck up quite a bit of the water color. And then apply clean water to the area. That pushes the pigment to the edge and will effectively create a very fine, sharp line, something much sharper than I could ever achieve by painting it in with a brush. And I can lighten it to any extent I want, just by sucking up more water and either leaving it alone or applying more fresh water into that area, never touching the edge. Now when that dries, I could work in an adjacent area, working in the next vein, I flow in another area, studying my photo to make sure that edge line that will become the vein is where I need it to be, and it is. Now I lift out the color to lighten it up a bit, and I added some clean water which will push the paint towards the edge. Remember, watercolor will only flow where the paper has been dampened, and it'll stop once it reaches the dry area. So I have complete confidence that my color will not spread through. The painting is basically finished. I may continue to play with it a little bit more and develop some of the shadow areas and enrich some of the colors by applying light washes of color back into the painted areas. But at this point, I can say it's done. One final thing that I like to do, and it's optional, it's my personal preference, I like to paint these borders around it. It sort of frames the piece. And then when I frame it to hang it, I don't apply a matte. I hang it in a floater frame so the deckled edges are exposed. I love the look of that. I begin with a wash of neutral tint. I usually start at a corner. And I'll go into a phthalo blue. You didn't see me use that too often in this watercolor. Washing it in such a way that the paints intermingle and flow into one another. And I have fun with it. Little burnt sienna. I want to create variety and transitions of tone, but I don't want it to be garish. I want the colors to be subdued and grayed. Here's a color you didn't see me use in this painting, but I think it'd be really good for the border. Quinacridone Gold. Beautifully rich color. Much better idea to position the watercolor on something when you want to do that, because you run the risk of transferring paint to the surface, which I definitely don't want to do. Talk about the interaction of color. That's wonderful. I'm going to sprinkle a little salt into that border to enhance the texture in certain areas. The border is completely dry now, and you can see what the salt did. It gave it this little bit of a textural enhancement. The painting is finished. I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it and creating the painting.